Hi, I'm Natalie Harper, and 3 years ago, my mother stood in front of our entire extended family at Marcus's promotion dinner and announced that I was wasting everyone's time pretending I could become a doctor. She said I should stop embarrassing myself and find something more realistic, like teaching kindergarten. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But that wasn't even the most devastating part. What destroyed me wasn't the public humiliation or the way my father nodded in agreement while cutting his steak. It was finding out later that they had been actively sabotaging my medical school applications behind my back, calling admissions offices to withdraw my candidacy because they thought I was too fragile to handle rejection. They never expected that their interference would lead to a phone call that would change everything, or that their own actions would reveal a truth about our family that no one saw coming. The steam rose from my coffee cup in lazy spirals as I sat in the corner booth of Brew Bean Café, my organic chemistry textbook spread across the scratched wooden table like a battlefield. The October morning light filtered through rain-streaked windows, casting everything in a soft gray that matched my mood. Around me, the usual crowd of university students tapped away on laptops, their conversations a low hum of academic anxiety and caffeine-fueled determination. I should have been at home in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the comfort of familiar walls and my mother's weekend pancakes. But instead I was here, nursing my third cup of coffee and trying to memorize molecular structures in a space that felt more like home than the house I grew up in. My phone buzzed against the table, vibrating with the persistence of someone who expected an immediate response. Diana Harper flashed across the screen and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the way your body remembers stress before your mind catches up. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, already knowing what this conversation would cost me. "Natalie, sweetheart, you missed Sunday dinner again." Her voice carried that particular blend of disappointment and passive aggression that she had perfected over my 24 years of life. In the background, I could hear the clinking of silverware against china, the sound of a family meal continuing without me. "I told you last week I had to study. The MCAT is in 6 weeks, Mom." I kept my voice level, practiced in the art of not taking the bait. "Oh, honey, about that." There was a pause, the kind that made my stomach drop before I even knew why. "Your father and I have been talking, and we really think it's time you considered other options. Dr. Stevens mentioned that the community college has an excellent nursing program, and wouldn't that be more practical? You could still help people but without all this stress and competition." I stared at the chemical equation in front of me, watching the letters blur as my vision went slightly out of focus. That word had been following me around for months, whispered behind cupped hands at family gatherings, delivered with concerned smiles from relatives who thought they were being helpful. Marcus had never been called practical when he announced his intention to attend Harvard Law. Vanessa hadn't been called practical when she started her boutique interior design business with money borrowed from 3 different family members. The nursing program deadline passed in August, Mom. Besides, that's not what I want to do. "Well, what you want and what you're capable of aren't always the same thing, darling. We just don't want to see you get hurt when you don't get in anywhere. Medical school is incredibly competitive, and you know how sensitive you've always been to disappointment." The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. A group of pre-med students at the next table were discussing their volunteer hours at the free clinic downtown, their voices bright with the kind of confidence I used to possess before every family conversation became a negotiation about my future. I closed my textbook carefully, running my fingers along its worn spine. "I have to go, Mom. I'll call you later." "Natalie, wait. Marcus wanted me to tell you that his firm is always looking for good paralegals. The pay is decent, and you wouldn't need any additional schooling. Think about it, okay?" I hung up before I could say something I would regret, though part of me wondered if speaking my mind might actually feel better than this constant swallowing of words. The students at the next table had moved on to discussing their research projects, and I found myself eavesdropping on their excitement about cell cultures and lab rotations, their easy assumption that their futures in medicine were inevitable rather than impossible dreams. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Rachel Kim, my study partner and the closest thing I had to family in this city. "Coffee date canceled. Saw you through the window, And you look like someone stole your last granola. I glanced up to see her standing outside, her dark hair whipping around her face in the October wind, wearing scrubs from her shift at the hospital where she worked as a medical scribe. Rachel had been my anchor through 2 years of pre-med coursework. The friend who stayed up until 3 in the morning helping me understand biochemical pathways and who never once suggested that I should consider something more realistic. She slid into the booth across from me, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and the industrial soap they used in hospital bathrooms. Family phone call? How did you know? You get that look, like someone just told you that gravity doesn't actually exist and you're trying not to float away. She signaled the barista for her usual order, a drink so complicated that I had memorized it by proxy. What did they say this time? I told her about the nursing program suggestion, about Marcus's paralegal offer, about the careful way my mother had delivered each alternative as though she were offering me a life preserver instead of an anchor. Rachel listened without interrupting, her dark eyes growing more focused with each detail. You know what this is, right? She said when I finished. They're scared. Scared of what? That I'll embarrass them by failing. Scared that you'll succeed. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the kind of whisper you use when sharing secrets. Think about it, Nat. Marcus has always been the golden child, the one with the impressive career and the corner office. If you become Dr. Natalie Harper, where does that leave him? Where does that leave them? I had never considered this possibility, that my family's discouragement might stem from fear rather than concern. It felt both liberating and terrifying, like discovering that the maze you've been trying to solve actually has no exit because someone keeps moving the walls. Besides, Rachel continued, since when has your mother cared about practical? She spent $15,000 on a designer handbag last month and tried to write it off as a business expense because she carried it to Marcus's office party. This was true. Diana Harper had many virtues, but fiscal responsibility had never been among them. She was the same woman who hired a professional organizer to arrange her walk-in closet by color and season, who insisted on buying organic produce that cost twice as much as regular vegetables because she read an article about pesticide, who had never worked a day in her life, but spoke with authority about the challenges of modern careers. Maybe I should just switch majors, I said, the words feeling strange and bitter in my mouth. Maybe they're right, and I'm just being stubborn. Rachel reached across the table and grabbed my wrist with the kind of grip that meant business. Natalie Harper, I have watched you study harder than anyone I know. You volunteer at the free clinic every weekend, you've shadowed more doctors than most people meet in a lifetime, and your MCAT practice scores are in the top 10%. Don't you dare let them convince you that you're not smart enough for this. The conviction in her voice was startling, like being handed a mirror that showed a completely different reflection than the one you were used to seeing. In Rachel's eyes, I wasn't the family disappointment, or the girl who needed to be more realistic about her limitation. I was someone worth fighting for, someone whose dreams deserved to be taken seriously. What if I don't get in anywhere? Then you apply again next year, and the year after that if necessary. Some of the best doctors I know didn't get in on their first try. She released my wrist and sat back, her expression softening. But you will get in, Nat. I know it. The confidence in her voice was infectious, and for a moment, I felt that old surge of determination, the feeling that had carried me through 2 years of organic chemistry and physics, through countless hours in anatomy lab, learning the names of muscles and bones, through sleepless nights spent reading medical journals that most people would find incomprehensibly boring. Medicine wasn't just what I wanted to do, it was who I was, had been since I was 8 years old and watched my grandfather's cardiologist explain his heart condition with such gentle expertise that it transformed a terrifying diagnosis into something manageable and hopeful. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from my father. Dinner at the Grandview tomorrow night, 7 sharp. Marcus has news. The Grandview was Cedar Falls' attempt at fine dining, the kind of restaurant where the menu had no prices, and the waiters wore ties that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. It was where the Harper family gathered for announcements, celebrations, and the kind of conversations that required neutral territory because someone might storm out. Family dinner tomorrow, I told Rachel, showing her the text. The fancy place, the fancy place. That's either really good news or really bad news. There's no middle ground with your family, and the Grandview. This was unfortunately accurate. The last time we had gathered at the Grandview, it was to celebrate Marcus making junior partner at his law firm. Before that, it had been to discuss my grandmother's estate, and the complicated feelings that arose when money changes hands between people who love each other conditionally. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on my studies, but my mind kept drifting to tomorrow night's dinner and the mysterious news that Marcus apparently had to share. In my family, news was rarely just news. It was an opportunity for comparison, a chance to highlight achievements, and by extension, the lack thereof in other family members. The next evening, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror trying to decide if my navy dress was appropriate for whatever awaited me at the Grandview. It was simple, professional, the kind of outfit that said I was taking this family gathering seriously without trying too hard to impress anyone. I had learned through years of trial and error that with the Harper family, your clothing choices were just another way to be judged, another opportunity to fall short of expectations that were never clearly stated but always somehow violated. The drive to the restaurant took me through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the university campus where I had spent the last 4 years of my life, past the coffee shops and bookstores that had become my refuge from family obligation. The October evening was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that made everything look like a postcard and made you remember why you loved the Midwest despite its long winters and unpredictable spring. The Grandview sat on a hill, overlooking the river, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Valet parking attendants, in burgundy vests, directed luxury cars into neat rows, and I felt that familiar sense of displacement as I handed over the keys to my 7-year-old Honda Civic. The car had been a graduation gift from my parents, practical and reliable, the automotive equivalent of their expectations for my life. Inside, the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of people who were accustomed to spending money on experiences rather than necessity. The hostess, a young woman with perfect posture and a smile that looked professionally trained, led me through the dining room to a table near the windows where my family was already gathered. Marcus stood to greet me, his embrace warm but brief, the kind of hug you give when other people are watching. He looked every inch the successful attorney in his charcoal suit and silk tie, his hair styled in a way that probably required more maintenance than my entire morning routine. Vanessa, his wife of 3 years, offered me her cheek to kiss, her perfume expensive and subtle, her jewelry catching the light from the chandelier overhead. My parents were already seated, my mother resplendent in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my rent, my father wearing the navy blazer he reserved for occasions that required him to look distinguished rather than merely wealthy. They looked like the kind of family you might see in a magazine advertisement for luxury cars or retirement planning services, all coordinated colors and confident smiles. "Natalie, darling, you look lovely," my mother said, though her eyes performed the quick assessment that I had learned to recognize over the years, taking inventory of my appearance and finding it adequate but unremarkable. I took my seat between my father and an empty chair that I assumed was reserved for Marcus's announcement, whatever that might entail. The table was set with the kind of precision that made you afraid to touch anything. Multiple forks and glasses arranged in perfect symmetry, cloth napkins folded into shapes that seemed too artistic to actually use. "So," my father said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him successful in commercial real estate, "Marcus has some exciting news to share." Marcus cleared his throat and reached for Vanessa's hand in a gesture that was clearly rehearsed. "Well, the first thing is that the firm has offered me a position as senior partner, the youngest in the company's history." The table erupted in congratulations, my mother clapping her hands together with genuine delight, my father raising his wineglass in a toast that seemed to encompass not just Marcus's achievement but the entire Harper family legacy. I added my own congratulations to the chorus, meaning them sincerely despite the familiar sting of being perpetually on the sidelines of such celebrations. "And," Marcus continued, his smile growing wider, "Vanessa and I are expecting our first child." This announcement produced an even bigger reaction, my mother actually standing up to embrace Vanessa, my father calling for the sommelier to bring champagne worthy of such momentous news. The restaurant seemed to fade away as the family focused entirely on Marcus and Vanessa, their questions and exclamations creating a bubble of excitement that I observed from what felt like a great distance. I offered my congratulations and asked the appropriate questions about due dates and nursery plans, playing my role as the supportive sister and future aunt. But underneath the surface pleasantries, I felt that familiar sense of being a supporting character in someone else's story, the family member whose primary function was to provide an audience for other people's achievements. A Harper grandchild, my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. I can hardly believe it. Richard, we need to start thinking about college funds, private schools. This baby will have every advantage. Of course, my father replied, already mentally calculating investment strategies and educational opportunities. Nothing but the best for the next generation. The conversation continued around me, focused entirely on Marcus and Vanessa's news, their plans for the future, the ways in which this pregnancy would change and enhance the family dynamic. I sipped my wine and listened, genuinely happy for my brother, but increasingly aware of my own invisibility in these discussions of the family's future. It wasn't until we were halfway through our entrees that my mother turned her attention to me, her expression shifting from celebration to concern in a way that made my stomach clench with anticipation. Speaking of the future, she said, her voice taking on that particular tone that meant an intervention was coming. Your father and I have been thinking about your situation, Natalie. My situation, this medical school pursuit. We're worried that you're setting yourself up for disappointment, sweetheart. The competition is so fierce, and you've always been such a sensitive child. We just want to protect you from the kind of heartbreak that could derail your entire future. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into background static as every person at the table turned their attention to me. This was clearly planned, a coordinated effort to address what they saw as the problem of my unrealistic ambitions during a gathering where I would be least likely to cause a scene. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm doing well in my studies. My MCAT practice scores are competitive, and I have strong letters of recommendation from my professors. But darling, my mother continued, her voice gentle but insistent, even if you did get accepted somewhere, the financial burden would be enormous. Medical school debt can follow you for decades, and there's no guarantee you'd be able to handle the pressure of the program itself, not to mention the hours. Vanessa added, speaking for the first time since the pregnancy announcement. Doctors work terrible schedules. How would you ever have a family or a normal life? I looked around the table, realizing that this conversation had been choreographed in advance, that they had all agreed on this approach to talking me out of my dreams. The united front of family concern was overwhelming, their voices blending together in a chorus of practical objections and loving discouragement. Marcus, my father said, turning to my brother, didn't you say your firm has opportunities for bright young people without extensive education requirements? Marcus nodded, though he looked slightly uncomfortable with being pulled into this intervention. There are always paralegal positions opening up. Good starting salary, room for advancement, normal hours. It's honest work. The phrase honest work hit me like a physical blow, as though pursuing medicine was somehow dishonest, a deception I was trying to pull on the world rather than a calling I had nurtured for years. I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, the polite smile I had worn throughout dinner, feeling increasingly brittle. What if this is what I really want? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. What if medicine isn't just a backup plan or a phase I'm going through? Oh, sweetheart, my mother said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more dismissive than comforting. Of course you want to help people. That's what makes you such a caring person. But there are so many ways to do that, without putting yourself through years of struggle and debt. Teaching, my father suggested. You've always been good with children. Elementary education is a noble profession, and you'd have summers off to spend with your own family someday. Or nursing, Vanessa added. My sister loves being a nurse. Regular hours, good job security, and you still get to work in healthcare. Each suggestion felt like another door closing, another path being blocked by people who claimed to love me but seemed incapable of seeing me as anything other than a collection of limitations and reasonable alternatives. I looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA and my childhood memories, and realized that they had never actually believed I was capable of achieving something extraordinary. "I need some air," I said, standing up from the table with as much dignity as I could manage. "Natalie, please don't be dramatic," my mother called after me, but I was already walking toward the restaurant's exit, past tables full of families who seemed to be having more supportive conversations than mine. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. I walked to the edge of the restaurant's parking lot, where a small garden overlooked the river below. The water moved slowly in the darkness, reflecting the lights from the bridge and the buildings on the opposite shore. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "How's the family dinner? Should I send rescue backup?" I typed back. "They staged an intervention to talk me out of medical school. I'm currently hiding in the parking lot." Her response came immediately. "Those absolute idiots. Do you need me to come get you?" The offer was tempting, but I knew I needed to go back inside and finish this conversation, if only to establish some boundaries around my own life and choice. I had spent too many years accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of my own dreams. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to safer topics, nursery themes, and baby names, the kind of discussions that required no difficult choices or uncomfortable truth. My parents looked relieved to see me back, as though my brief absence had proven their point about my inability to handle difficult situations. "Feeling better, sweetheart?" my mother asked. "Actually, I've been thinking about what you all said, and I realize I need to be clearer about my intentions." I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, drawing on every lesson I had learned about staying calm under pressure. "I'm taking the MK in 5 weeks. I'm applying to medical school this cycle. This isn't a whim or a phase. It's what I'm going to do." The table fell silent, the kind of quiet that descends when someone has violated the unspoken rules of family harmony. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, my mother's smile became fixed and artificial, and Marcus looked down at his plate as though he wished he could disappear entirely. "Natalie," my father said finally, his voice carrying the tone he used in business negotiations when someone had made an unreasonable offer, "we're just trying to help you avoid a painful mistake. I know you think you are, but this is my mistake to make." "It's not just your mistake," my mother said, her voice rising slightly. "When you fail, it reflects on all of us. When people ask what Diana Harper's daughter is doing with her life, what am I supposed to say? That she's drowning in debt from a degree she couldn't finish." There it was, the truth underneath all the concern and loving guidance. This wasn't about protecting me from disappointment. It was about protecting them from embarrassment. My potential failure wasn't just a personal setback. It was a family reputation risk that needed to be managed and contained. "You could say that she's pursuing her dreams," I suggested. "Or you could say nothing at all." "Don't be flippant, Natalie. This is serious." "You're right, it is serious. Which is why I need you to trust that I've thought this through and made an informed decision about my own life." The waiter appeared at our table, probably sensing the tension and hoping to provide some distraction with dessert menus and coffee options. My father waved him away with an impatient gesture, his focus entirely on what he clearly saw as my unreasonable stubbornness. "Fine," he said finally. "If you're determined to do this, you'll do it without our financial support. We won't be responsible for funding a venture we don't believe in." This wasn't entirely surprising, but hearing it stated so bluntly still felt like a physical blow. I had been working part-time throughout college, and had saved money for application fees and test prep, but medical school was an entirely different financial commitment, one that would require loans and careful budgeting and probably some form of family support. "I understand," I said, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "And when this doesn't work out," my mother added, "we want you to promise that you'll seriously consider other options. We're not going to watch you waste years of your life chasing something that isn't realistic." I looked around the table one more time, at these people who had raised me and fed me and paid for my education, who genuinely believed they were protecting me from heartbreak and failure. They saw my dreams as delusions, my ambition as naivety, my determination as an inability to accept reality. "I promise," I said finally, "that I'll consider all my options based on the actual results of my efforts, not on your assumptions about my capabilities." It wasn't the promise they wanted, but it was the only one I could give. The rest of dinner passed in stilted conversation about safer topics, baby preparations and holiday plans, the kind of small talk that families use to avoid addressing the larger rifts that threaten to tear them apart. When we finally left the restaurant, my parents' goodbyes were cooler than usual, their embraces brief and somewhat formal. Marcus walked me to my car, his expression apologetic but not quite guilty enough to suggest he disagreed with the evening's intervention. "They mean well, Nat," he said as I unlocked my car door. "I know they do. That's what makes it so hard. If you need anything during this process, anything I can help with that doesn't involve money, you know you can call me, right?" I nodded, though I wondered if he would still feel that way when his parents started pressuring him to maintain family unity by withdrawing his support for my unrealistic plan. Marcus had always been caught between his role as the favored son and his genuine affection for me, and I had learned not to count on him when those loyalties came into conflict. The drive home took me back through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the university campus, where I would spend the next 5 weeks preparing for the most important test of my life, past the medical center where I volunteered every weekend, past the future I was determined to claim, despite every obstacle my family seemed determined to place in my path. Back in my apartment, I called Rachel and told her about the dinner, about the intervention and the financial threats, and the way my family had made it clear that my dreams were not just unrealistic but potentially embarrassing to people who mattered more than I did. "They're going to feel pretty stupid when you're Dr. Natalie Harper," she said, her voice fierce with loyalty. "What if they're right, though? What if I am being unrealistic? Then you'll be unrealistic with a medical degree and a career you love. There are worse things in life than being wrong about your own limitations." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my MCAT prep books spread out around me like a fortress against doubt. The path ahead looked longer and more difficult than it had that morning, but it was still my path, still the direction I needed to go regardless of who believed in me or supported my choices. I opened my biochemistry review book and began to study, the familiar rhythm of reading and note-taking, settling my nerves and reminding me why I had chosen this difficult journey in the first place. Medicine wasn't just what I wanted to do with my life, it was who I was meant to become, and no amount of family discouragement could change that fundamental truth about myself. The next 5 weeks would test everything I had learned about persistence and self-belief, but tonight, in the quiet of my apartment with my books and my dreams spread out before me, I felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks following the dinner at the Grandview passed in a blur of practice tests and sleepless nights, each day bringing me closer to the MCAT while simultaneously revealing new ways my family had decided to express their disapproval of my choices. It started small, almost imperceptibly, like a slow leak in a tire that you don't notice until you're already stranded on the side of the road. The first sign came 3 days after our restaurant confrontation, when I received a phone call from Dr. Tricia Reeves, my pre-med advisor at the university. Her voice carried an unusual hesitation, the kind of careful tone people use when they're delivering news they don't quite understand themselves. "Natalie, I had the strangest conversation this morning. Your mother called my office asking about your academic performance and whether I thought you were," and I quote, "emotionally equipped for the rigors of medical training." Dr. Reeves paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I told her that student information is confidential and that any concerns about your readiness should come from you directly, but I wanted you to know about the call." I sat in my car outside the campus library, gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles went white. The October afternoon was unseasonably warm, and students were sprawled across the quad in shorts and t-shirts, their laughter drifting through my open window like a reminder of the carefree college experience I had never quite managed to have. "What exactly did she say?" "She mentioned that you've been under a lot of stress lately, that she was worried about your mental health, and that she wanted to make sure I was aware of any concerning behavior." She asked if there were protocols in place for students who might be pursuing unrealistic goals as a way of avoiding real-world responsibilities. The clinical language made my skin crawl. My mother had reduced my medical school ambitions to a psychological condition, a form of escapism, that required intervention and management. I thanked Dr. Reeves for letting me know and hung up, sitting in my car for several minutes, trying to process this new level of interference. That evening, I called Rachel and told her about my mother's conversation with my advisor. She listened in the kind of silence that meant she was either furious or formulating a plan, possibly both. "They're not just trying to discourage you anymore," she said finally. "They're actively trying to sabotage you. This is psychological warfare disguised as parental concern. Maybe she really is worried about my mental health. Maybe they all are." "Natalie, stop. You know what gaslighting is, right? When someone makes you question your own perception of reality until you start doubting everything you know to be true about yourself." I did know what gaslighting was, had studied it in my psychology courses, and recognized it in case studies and research paper. But experiencing it from your own family was different, more insidious, because it came wrapped in love and concern and the lifetime of trust you had placed in people who were supposed to want the best for you. What am I supposed to do? Change my phone number? Cut off all contact until after medical school applications are submitted? Actually, that's not a terrible idea. But first, we need to figure out what other damage they might have done. The next morning, I spent 3 hours making phone calls to every doctor I had shadowed, every volunteer coordinator who had worked with me, every professor who had agreed to write letters of recommendation. One by one, I confirmed that my references were still intact, that no one had received mysterious calls questioning my character or competence. Dr. Amanda Foster, the cardiologist who had been my most important mentor, was the last person on my list. She had known me for 2 years, had watched me work with patients in her clinic, and had written what she described as one of the strongest recommendation letters of her career. When I explained why I was calling, her voice became sharp with professional indignation. "No one has contacted me, Natalie, but if they had, I would have given them a very clear picture of your abilities and character. What your family is doing is not only inappropriate, it's potentially damaging to your future in ways they probably don't understand." "What do you mean?" Medical school admissions committees take character concerns seriously. If someone were to raise questions about your mental health or emotional stability, even informally, it could influence how your application is reviewed. The fact that your own family is undermining you suggests a level of dysfunction that goes beyond normal parental concern. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, staring at my MCAT prep materials, trying to calculate how much damage my family could do to my future if they really committed themselves to the effort. They had my social security number, my personal information, access to details about my life that could be taken out of context and presented in the worst possible light. That afternoon, I drove to the legal aid clinic downtown, a cramped office in a converted house where law students provided free consultations to people who couldn't afford private attorneys. The waiting room smelled like coffee and photocopier toner, and the walls were covered with posters about tenant rights and domestic violence resources. Stephen Walsh was a third-year law student with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he had seen enough human cruelty to no longer be surprised by it. He listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. "What you're describing could potentially qualify as harassment or interference with your educational pursuits," he said when I finished. "The problem is that family members have a lot of leeway in terms of expressing concern about each other's choices, even when that concern crosses the line into sabotage. So, there's nothing I can do. There are things we can do to protect you going forward. We can send a cease and desist letter to your parents, formally requesting that they stop contacting your school, your advisors, or anyone else involved in your education. It won't stop them from expressing their opinions to you directly, but it will create a legal record if they continue to interfere with your academic and professional relationships." "Will that make things worse with my family?" Stephen looked up from his notes, his expression both sympathetic and pragmatic. "Natalie, things are already bad with your family. They're actively working against your goals and disguising it as love. A cease and desist letter won't repair your relationship with them, but it might prevent them from destroying your future. I authorized him to draft the letter, providing him with the contact information for my parents and a detailed account of every instance of interference I could remember. As I signed the paperwork, I felt like I was crossing a line that I could never uncross, choosing my own future over family harmony in a way that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. The letter was delivered to my parents' house on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning my phone was buzzing with angry calls and text messages. I let them all go to voicemail, but I couldn't resist listening to the messages, each one revealing new layers of hurt and outrage that I had dared to involve lawyers in what they considered a private family matter. My father's voice was clipped and businesslike, the tone he used when someone had violated the terms of a contract. "Natalie, this legal nonsense is completely inappropriate. We are your parents, and we have not only the right but the responsibility to express our concerns about your choices. Call me immediately so we can resolve this like adults." My mother's message was longer and more emotional, her voice cycling through hurt, anger, and bewilderment in a way that made me question whether I had overreacted to what might have been normal parental behavior. "Sweetheart, I don't understand why you would involve strangers in our family business. Everything we've done has been out of love and concern for your well-being. This legal threat is hurtful and unnecessary, and it's exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction that makes us worry about your emotional stability." Marcus left the shortest message, just 10 words that somehow carried more weight than his parents' lengthy speeches. "Call me when you're ready to act like family again." I didn't call any of them back. Instead, I threw myself into MCAT preparation with the kind of focused intensity that bordered on obsession. I spent 12 hours a day in the library, working through practice problems and memorizing organic chemistry reactions, using academic achievement as both a shield against family drama and a weapon against the voice in my head that whispered maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't smart enough, maybe I was just too stubborn to admit defeat. Rachel found me there one evening in late October, slumped over a physics textbook with highlighter marks on my fingers and what she later described as the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been studying for so long that they had forgotten what the outside world looked like. "When was the last time you ate something that wasn't from a vending machine?" she asked, sliding into the chair across from me. I had to think about it. "Tuesday maybe, you brought me that sandwich." "Nat, it's Friday. You can't survive on caffeine and determination alone." She packed up my books over my protests and dragged me to a diner near campus, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and never judged you for looking like you had been living in a library, over pancakes and coffee that actually tasted like something other than desperation. She updated me on her own life, the medical scribe job that was teaching her more about healthcare than 4 years of pre-med coursework, the application she was submitting for a post-baccalaureate program that would strengthen her own medical school candidacy. "Have you heard anything from your family since the cease and desist letter?" she asked, cutting her pancakes into precise squares the way she approached everything in her life. "Lots of voicemails and texts. I haven't responded to any of them. They need to understand that their behavior has consequences. What if I'm being too harsh? What if they really are just worried about me and I'm interpreting their concern as sabotage?" Rachel set down her fork and looked at me with the kind of direct gaze that cut through all the self-doubt and second-guessing. "Natalie, worried parents ask questions and offer support. They don't call your advisor to suggest that you're mentally unstable. They don't try to convince you that your dreams are delusions. What they're doing isn't love, it's control. But what if they're right about me not being smart enough? What if I am just being stubborn and unrealistic? Then you'll find out when you take the MCAT and apply to but you'll find out based on actual evidence, not on their assumptions about your limitations." The MCAT was scheduled for a Saturday morning in early November, and I arrived at the testing center 2 hours early, sitting in my car in the parking lot and running through last-minute review notes, until my hands were too shaky to hold the pages steady. The building was a nondescript office complex that had been converted into a standardized testing facility, all fluorescent lights and beige carpet, designed to be as sterile and intimidating as possible. Inside, dozens of other pre-med students sat in rows of computer stations, their faces reflecting the same mixture of preparation and terror that I felt churning in my own stomach. Some of them looked confident, even relaxed, as though taking a 7-hour exam that would determine their professional future was just another Saturday morning activity. Others looked like they might throw up on their keyboard. I found my assigned seat and began the ritual of emptying my pockets, storing my belongings in a locker, and submitting to the kind of security screening usually reserved for airports and courthouses. The proctor, a middle-aged woman with the demeanor of someone who had seen thousands of nervous students come and go, explained the rules and procedures with the detached efficiency of a flight attendant delivering safety instruction. Then the test began, and for the next 7 hours, nothing existed except the computer screen in front of me, and the questions that would determine whether the last 4 years of my life had been preparation for a career in medicine, or an expensive lesson in overestimating my own ability. The science sections felt manageable, even familiar, like conversations with old friends who spoke in the language of molecular structures and physiological processes. The reading comprehension passages were dense and challenging, but I had spent years training myself to extract meaning from complex medical literature. The psychology and sociology questions drew on coursework that had always fascinated me, the intersection of human behavior and health outcome. By the time I finished, the sun was setting and the parking lot was nearly empty. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what I had just experienced and resist the urge to mentally review every question I wasn't sure about. The test was done, submitted, locked into the electronic system that would spend the next month calculating my score and by extension my future. I drove home in a strange state of emotional exhaustion, too tired to feel either optimistic or pessimistic about my performance. Rachel was waiting in my apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, and a bottle of wine that she claimed was for celebrating the completion of the test, regardless of the eventual results. "How do you feel?" she asked, as we spread pad thai and green curry across my coffee table. "Empty, like I've been holding my breath for months and finally exhaled. That's normal. Now comes the hardest part. Waiting for the scores, waiting for the scores, submitting applications, waiting for interviews, waiting for acceptance letters. Basically waiting for your entire future to be decided by people you've never met." We ate in comfortable silence, watching a medical drama on television, and critiquing the unrealistic portrayal of hospital life based on Rachel's experience working with actual doctors. It felt good to laugh at something, to remember that life contained moments of lightness even in the middle of pursuing dreams that sometimes felt too big for the person carrying them. My MCAT scores arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered via email with the kind of clinical efficiency that made the number feel both anticlimactic and life-changing. I stared at the screen for several minutes, reading and rereading the score report to make sure I hadn't misunderstood the numbers. 506. I called Rachel immediately, unable to keep the news to myself for even the few hours it would take to see her in person. She screamed so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, her excitement carrying through the speaker and filling my apartment with the kind of joy that I hadn't felt in months. "I knew it," she kept saying. "I knew you could do this. Your family is going to feel so stupid when they find out." But even as I celebrated with Rachel, part of me wondered if my family would find out at all. We hadn't spoken since the cease and desist letter, and the silence between us felt both protective and lonely, like living in a house with all the windows boarded up. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and began the process of completing medical school application. The online portal was overwhelming in its complexity, demanding everything from academic transcripts to personal statements to detailed accounts of every volunteer experience and research project I had ever participated in. The personal statement was the most challenging part, the essay that was supposed to explain not just why I wanted to become a doctor, but who I was as a person and what I would bring to the profession. I wrote draft after draft, trying to capture my passion for medicine without sounding naive, my determination without sounding arrogant, my experiences without dwelling on the family conflicts that had shaped so much of my recent thinking about my future. Dr. Foster reviewed my essay and suggested changes that made it stronger and more authentic. She helped me understand that admissions committees weren't looking for perfection, they were looking for people who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of being a physician, who had tested their commitment through real-world experience, and who could articulate their motivations in ways that went beyond vague desires to help people. By December, I had submitted applications to 15 medical schools, a mixture of state universities and private institutions, reach schools and safety schools, programs that emphasized research and others that focused on primary care. Each application required a secondary essay, additional questions that probed deeper into my background and motivations, and supplemental materials that demonstrated my fit with their particular mission and value. The application fees alone cost more than 2 months of rent, a financial burden that reminded me daily of my family's withdrawal of support and my complete dependence on my own resources. I picked up extra shifts at the campus bookstore where I had worked throughout college, spending my evenings and weekends sorting inventory and helping underclassmen find overpriced textbooks for classes I had taken years earlier. Christmas approached with the strange unreality of a holiday that you observe more out of habit than enthusiasm. My parents sent a card with a generic message about hoping the new year would bring our family closer together, but no invitation to join their celebrations or acknowledgement of the medical school applications that had consumed my fall semester. Rachel invited me to spend Christmas with her family in Minneapolis, and I accepted gratefully, relieved to experience a holiday gathering where career choices were treated as interesting topics of conversation rather than sources of family conflict. Her parents asked thoughtful questions about my applications and shared stories about friends and relatives who had struggled through their own professional training, treating my medical school pursuit as a normal and admirable goal rather than evidence of dangerous delusion. On New Year's Eve, Rachel and I sat in my apartment, making resolutions and predictions for the coming year. She was confident that I would receive multiple acceptance letters and have the luxury of choosing between programs. I was more cautious, still carrying the weight of my family's doubts, and the statistical reality that medical school admission was competitive enough to destroy even well-qualified candidates. "What will you do if you don't get in anyway?" she asked, not out of pessimism but from the practical concern of someone who understood that backup plans were necessary even when you refused to believe you would need them. "Apply again next year. Take additional courses to strengthen my academic record. Maybe get a master's degree in public health or biomedical sciences. And if your family tries to use rejection as proof that they were right all along." This was the question that kept me awake at night, the scenario that felt more terrifying than academic failure itself. I could handle being wrong about my own abilities, could recover from disappointment, and try again with better preparation. But I wasn't sure I could handle my family's vindication, their gentle but persistent reminders that they had tried to protect me from exactly this kind of heartbreak. "Then I'll prove them wrong eventually," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt, "even if it takes longer than I planned." The first interview invitation arrived in mid-January, an email from the University of Wisconsin asking if I could travel to Madison for a day of interviews and information sessions in early February. I read the message 3 times before the reality sank in. A medical school wanted to meet me, considered me worthy of serious consideration for their program. More invitations followed over the next few weeks, a steady stream of emails that transformed my dining room table into a command center for coordinating travel arrangements and interview preparation. Each invitation felt like a small miracle, external validation that my MCAT scores and application materials had convinced strangers that I might actually have what it took to become a doctor. I bought my first professional suit, a conservative navy ensemble that made me look older and more serious than I felt. I practiced answering interview questions with Dr. Foster, learning to articulate my motivations and experiences in ways that sounded polished but not rehearsed. I researched each school's curriculum and mission, preparing to explain why their particular program aligned with my career goals and personal values. The Wisconsin interview was scheduled for a Friday in early February, and I drove through a snowstorm to reach Madison the night before, checking into a budget hotel near campus and spending the evening reviewing my notes and trying to calm my nerves. The next morning, I joined a group of other applicants in the medical school's admissions office, all of us wearing similar dark suits and expressions of carefully controlled anxiety. The day consisted of multiple interviews with faculty members, current students and admissions staff, each conversation lasting 30 minutes and covering different aspects of my background and motivation. Some interviewers were warm and conversational, treating the session like a friendly chat about shared interests in medicine. Others were more formal and challenging, asking pointed questions about ethical dilemmas and healthcare policy that required me to think carefully before responding. Between interviews, I toured the medical school facilities and attended information sessions about curriculum and student life. The other applicants were impressive and accomplished, people who had spent gap years conducting research or working in healthcare, who spoke multiple languages or had overcome significant personal challenges to reach this point in their lives. During lunch with current medical students, I found myself relaxing for the first time all day, listening to their honest accounts of the challenges and rewards of medical training. They talked about the overwhelming volume of information they had to master, the emotional difficulty of seeing patients suffer, the long hours and constant pressure to perform at the highest level. But they also talked about the moments that made it all worthwhile: successful diagnoses, grateful patients, the feeling of contributing to something larger and more important than themselves. The hardest part isn't the academic work, one second-year student told me over sandwiches in the hospital cafeteria. It's maintaining your sense of self when everyone around you is also incredibly smart and driven. You have to learn to measure your progress against your own goals rather than constantly comparing yourself to your classmates. I thought about this advice during the drive back to Cedar Falls about the importance of maintaining confidence in your own abilities even when surrounded by people who seemed more qualified or better prepared. Medical school would be challenging enough without the additional burden of imposing doubt that I had carried throughout my pre-med year. The thank you notes I wrote to my interviewers were carefully crafted expressions of gratitude and continued interest, each one personalized with specific details from our conversation. I had learned that these follow-up communications were important not just as courtesy but as opportunities to reinforce positive impressions and demonstrate genuine enthusiasm for their program. February and March passed in a blur of interviews and travel, weekend trips to universities across the Midwest and East Coast, each visit adding to my understanding of medical education and my confidence that I belonged in this world. Some interviews went better than others, some schools felt like better fits for my personality and goals, but each experience strengthened my belief that I was pursuing the right path regardless of what my family thought about my chances of success. The first acceptance letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, delivered via email with the subject line "Congratulations from the University of Minnesota Medical School." I stared at the screen for several minutes, reading the message over and over until the words began to blur with tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. I called Rachel immediately, interrupting her shift at the hospital with news that made her cry harder than I was. We made plans to celebrate that evening, but first I needed to process what this acceptance meant, not just for my career but for my relationship with my family and my understanding of my own capability. The University of Minnesota wasn't my top choice, but it was a solid program with a strong reputation for primary care training and a commitment to serving underserved populations. More importantly, it was proof that medical schools saw potential in me, that my application materials and interview performance had convinced admissions committees that I could succeed in their programs. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more acceptance letters arrived, each one adding to my sense of vindication and expanding my options for medical training. The University of Iowa offered a scholarship that would cover half of my tuition costs. The Medical College of Wisconsin praised my research experience and invited me to join their physician scientist training program. The University of Illinois included a handwritten note from the dean expressing enthusiasm for my commitment to rural healthcare. For the first time in months, I felt like I had choices rather than just hopes. I could afford to be selective about which program offered the best fit for my goals and learning style. I could negotiate scholarship terms and compare curricula with the confidence of someone who was wanted rather than someone who was begging for admission. The hardest decision was whether to tell my family about my acceptances. Part of me wanted to share the news, to prove that their doubts had been unfounded and their interference unnecessary. But another part of me wondered if involving them in my success would only create new opportunities for them to insert themselves into decisions that should be mine alone to make. I decided to wait until I had chosen a school and confirmed my enrollment, to present my family with a fait accompli rather than an opportunity for debate and second-guessing. This felt both mature and petty, a way of protecting my decisions while also denying them the chance to take credit for my achievements. In early April, I received an email that changed everything. Not just about my medical school options, but about my understanding of my own potential and the value of persistence in the face of doubt. The subject line was simple and formal: Research Fellowship Opportunity, Mayo Clinic. Amanda Foster had forwarded me an announcement about a summer research program for incoming medical students, a competitive fellowship that would provide funding for 10 weeks of cardiovascular research at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The program was designed for students who showed exceptional promise in both academic achievement and clinical research, and selection was based on MCAT scores, research experience, and letters of recommendation from faculty mentor. The application deadline was in 2 days, barely enough time to complete the required essays and gather additional references. I spent the next 48 hours crafting responses to questions about my research interests and career goals, drawing on my experience in Dr. Foster's clinic and my understanding of cardiovascular medicine to articulate a compelling case for my inclusion in the program. The competition was national, open to accepted medical students from across the country, and the selection committee included some of the most prominent physicians and researchers in cardiovascular medicine. I submitted my application with the same mixture of hope and resignation that had characterized my entire medical school journey, knowing that I had done my best work but understanding that the final decision was out of my hands. The notification came 3 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon when I was working at the campus bookstore, and trying not to think about all the ways my life might change depending on the contents of various emails I was expecting to receive. My phone buzzed with a new message, and I almost ignored it until I saw the sender: Mayo Clinic, Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. Congratulations, Natalie. We are pleased to offer you a position in our summer research fellowship program for incoming medical students. Your application impressed our selection committee, and we believe your research interests and academic background make you an excellent fit for our cardiovascular research initiatives. I read the message 3 times before the reality began to sink in. The Mayo Clinic, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world, wanted me to spend my summer conducting research alongside faculty members whose work I had been reading and admiring for years. This wasn't just validation of my academic abilities, it was recognition of my potential to contribute to medical knowledge and patient care at the highest level. I finished my shift at the bookstore in a daze, mechanically checking out textbooks and answering questions about course materials, while my mind raced through the implications of this fellowship offer. When Rachel picked me up that evening, I was still holding my phone, still staring at the email that represented everything I had worked to, and everything my family had insisted was beyond my reach. "You look like someone just told you that you won the lottery," she said as I got into her car. "Better than the lottery. The Mayo Clinic wants me to do research with them this summer." Rachel pulled over to the side of the road so that she could scream and hug me without endangering other drivers. We sat in her car for 20 minutes, calling Dr. Foster and my other mentors to share the news, each conversation adding to my sense of disbelief and gratitude. That night I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at my family's contact information, and trying to decide whether this news was worth breaking the silence that had protected me for the past 6 months. The Mayo Clinic fellowship felt different from medical school acceptances, more prestigious and unexpected, the kind of achievement that even skeptical parents might recognize as significant. In the end, I decided that my accomplishments belonged to me, not to the people who had tried to convince me they were impossible. I would share the news eventually when I was ready to deal with their reactions and their attempts to reshape my success into their own vindication. But for now, this moment belonged to me, and to the people who had believed in me when belief required courage rather than convenience. I closed my laptop and called Rachel back, and we spent the rest of the evening planning my summer in Rochester and imagining the research projects that might await me at one of the world's most respected medical institutions. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, pursuing exactly the path I was meant to follow, regardless of who understood or supported my choices. The silence from my family no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like freedom. The celebration dinner with Rachel that night felt like a turning point, not just in my career trajectory but in my understanding of what I was truly capable of achieving. We sat at our usual corner table at Giuseppe's, an Italian restaurant near campus, where the portions were generous and the atmosphere was warm enough to make any occasion feel special. The Mayo Clinic acceptance letter was printed out and folded carefully in my purse, a tangible reminder that the email hadn't been some elaborate dream or mistake. "So when do you tell them?" Rachel asked, twirling pasta around her fork with the kind of precision that suggested she was thinking about more than just dinner. "Tell who? Don't play dumb, Nat. Your family. When do you tell your family that their too stupid for medicine daughter just got accepted to do research at the Mayo Clinic?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a candle that had just been blown out. I had been avoiding thinking about my family's reaction, partly because I wasn't sure I was ready to reopen that door and partly because I wasn't sure what kind of response I was hoping for. An apology seemed unlikely. Genuine pride felt even more impossible. Maybe I don't tell them at all. Maybe some accomplishments are too precious to risk having them diminished by people who never believed in them in the first place. Rachel nodded slowly, understanding the protective instinct that made me want to keep my success separate from their skepticism. "But eventually they'll find out, right? Cedar Falls isn't that big a town, and the Mayo Clinic Fellowship isn't exactly a secret." She was right, of course. News like this had a way of traveling through social circles, especially in a community where medical achievements were rare enough to be noteworthy. Someone would mention it to someone else, and eventually it would reach my parents through the intricate network of acquaintances and professional contacts that connected everyone in Cedar Falls to everyone else. Let them find out from someone else then. Let them learn about it the same way I learned about their concerns regarding my emotional stability, through a third party who thought I should know what was being said about me. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. I had thought I was past the anger, had moved beyond the hurt of their interference and into a space of protective indifference, but apparently the wounds were still fresh enough to bleed when pressed. 2 days later, I was walking across campus after my shift at the bookstore when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The area code was local, but the caller ID showed only a business name: Harper and Associates Law Firm, my father's office. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over caution. "Hello, Natalie. It's Marcus." My brother's voice was carefully neutral, the tone he used when he was trying to navigate family politics without taking sides. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "That depends on what you want to talk about." "I heard some interesting news today. A colleague of mine mentioned that someone named Natalie Harper had been accepted to a summer research program at the Mayo Clinic." I told him that couldn't be right, because my sister would have mentioned something that's significant to her family. The sarcasm in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus had always been skilled at delivering criticism wrapped in concern, at making you feel guilty for choices he disagreed with without actually stating his objections directly. "Where did your colleague hear about it?" "Dr. Jennifer Morris. She's on the selection committee for the fellowship program. She mentioned it at a medical legal conference because she was impressed by the application from a local student. Apparently, the competition was quite intense." I sat down on a bench outside the library, watching students hurry past with backpacks and coffee cups, their conversations about upcoming exams and weekend plans feeling like echoes from a different life. "And you called to congratulate me." "I called because I'm confused about why you wouldn't share news like this with your family. This is exactly the kind of achievement that parents dream about celebrating with their children. Is because the last time I shared my dreams with our parents, they staged an intervention to convince me I was too emotionally unstable to pursue them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear office sounds in the background: phones ringing, voices in hallways, the ambient noise of a successful law practice. "They were trying to protect you from disappointment. Maybe they went about it the wrong way, but their intentions were good. Their intentions were to convince me that I wasn't capable of achieving something I had been working toward for years. They called my advisor to question my mental health. They withdrew their financial support to pressure me into giving up. Those aren't protective actions, Marcus. Those are controlling actions. Look, I'm not saying they handled everything perfectly, but this fellowship proves that you're succeeding despite their concerns. Not because they were wrong to have them. Maybe it's time to let them share in your success instead of using it as a weapon against them. The conversation ended shortly after that, with Marcus expressing hope that I would reconsider my position, and me promising nothing more than to think about what he had said. But his call had accomplished something he probably hadn't intended. It had reminded me that my achievements were becoming public knowledge, whether I chose to share them or not. That evening, I sat in my apartment, trying to study for final exams, while my mind wandered to the question of how to handle my family's inevitable discovery of my medical school acceptances and fellowship opportunity. Part of me wanted to control the narrative, to tell my own story rather than let them piece it together from secondhand information. But another part of me was reluctant to give them the satisfaction of knowing how well I had done, especially when their response was likely to be more about their own vindication than genuine pride in my accomplishment. The decision was made for me the following Saturday morning when I arrived at my apartment to find my mother sitting in her car in the parking lot. She was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and her hands were gripping the steering wheel in a way that suggested she had been sitting there for a while, working up the courage to approach my door. I considered turning around and leaving, but curiosity and a growing sense of my own strength convinced me to walk over to her car instead. She rolled down the window as I approached, and I could see that she had been crying, her makeup slightly smudged despite obvious efforts to repair it. "Hello, sweetheart. I was hoping we could talk. How long have you been sitting out here?" "About an hour. I wasn't sure if you were home, and I didn't want to knock and have you not answer the door." The admission was both pathetic and manipulative, designed to make me feel guilty for the distance between us while acknowledging that the distance was warranted. I stood beside her car for a moment, weighing my options and trying to gauge whether this conversation was worth the emotional energy it would require. "We can talk in my apartment," I said finally. "But I need you to understand that I'm not interested in relitigating our previous arguments, or listening to more concerns about my career choices." She nodded eagerly, too grateful for the opportunity to negotiate terms. I led her upstairs to my apartment, noting how she looked around the space with obvious surprise, as though she hadn't expected me to be living somewhere so neat and organized. The implications stung, the assumption that my life would be in shambles without their guidance and support. "Coffee," I offered, more out of habit than hospitality. "That would be lovely, thank you." I busied myself with the coffee maker while she settled on my couch, her presence making my small apartment feel even smaller. When I handed her a mug, she accepted it with both hands, like someone receiving communion or a peace offering. "I heard about the Mayo Clinic," she said without preamble. "Dr. Morrison's daughter goes to school with Vanessa's niece, and the news made its way back to us through that connection." "Okay. Natalie, I owe you an apology. We owe you an apology. Your father and I made assumptions about your abilities and your chances of success that were clearly unfounded." The words should have felt like vindication, but instead they felt hollow, like an apology that was being offered because circumstances had made it impossible to maintain their previous position rather than because they had genuinely reconsidered their behavior. "What exactly are you apologizing for? For not believing in you the way we should have? For trying to discourage you from pursuing something you were clearly meant to do, for interfering in your academic relationships in ways that were inappropriate and potentially harmful." She had clearly rehearsed this speech, probably with input from Marcus or my father, crafting language that acknowledged wrongdoing without accepting full responsibility for the damage it had caused. The words felt calculated rather than genuine, an attempt to repair our relationship without actually examining the deeper issues that had led to its deterioration. And if I hadn't gotten into medical school, if the Mayo Clinic hadn't offered me this fellowship, would you still be apologizing? Or would you be pointing to my failure as proof that you were right all along? She took a sip of coffee, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't damn her completely. "I like to think we would have supported you regardless of the outcome. But I can't honestly say that we wouldn't have felt vindicated if things had gone differently." The honesty was unexpected and somehow more hurtful than a lie would have been. At least it confirmed what I had suspected all along. Their love and support were conditional on my success meeting their definition of reasonable and appropriate. "The Mayo Clinic Fellowship is an incredible opportunity," she continued. "Your father and I are very proud of what you've accomplished, and we want to find a way to be part of your success going forward." Part of my success, how? Well, we know that medical school is expensive, and even with scholarships, you'll probably need some financial assistance. We want to help with that, if you'll let us. And there it was, the real purpose of this visit. They wanted to buy their way back into my life, to use financial support as a tool for regaining influence over my choices. The offer was tempting. Medical school debt was a real concern, and family money could provide security and options that I couldn't afford on my own. But accepting their help would also mean accepting their right to have opinions about how I used it. What strings would be attached to that financial assistance? No strings. We just want to support our daughter's education and career. The same daughter whose emotional stability you questioned with her academic advisor. The same daughter you tried to convince to become a paralegal because medical school was too competitive and stressful. My mother set down her coffee mug and leaned forward, her expression shifting from conciliatory to frustrated. Natalie, we made mistakes. We've acknowledged that. But at some point, you need to decide whether you want to hold on to your anger or move forward as a family. I'm not holding on to anger. I'm protecting myself from people who have demonstrated that their support is conditional on my choices aligning with their preferences. That's not fair, isn't it? 6 months ago, you were convinced that I was too stupid for medicine and that pursuing medical school was evidence of emotional instability. Now that I've proven you wrong, you want to celebrate my success and provide financial support. What happens when I make a choice you disagree with again? What happens when I specialize in something you think is inappropriate, or take a job in a location you don't approve of, or make personal decisions that don't align with your vision of my life? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her working through the implications of my questions, perhaps recognizing for the first time that this conversation was about more than just medical school or family reconciliation. It was about the fundamental dynamic between us, the pattern of conditional love and manipulative support that had shaped our relationship for years. We love you, Natalie. Everything we did came from a place of love. I know you love me. But love isn't enough if it comes with conditions and expectations that require me to be someone other than who I am. She left shortly after that, promising to talk to my father about what I had said, and expressing hope that we could find a way to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. I watched her car pull out of the parking lot and felt something that might have been relief mixed with sadness, the complex emotions that come with setting boundaries that are necessary but painful to maintain. The next few weeks passed in a blur of final exams and graduation preparation. My academic performance had been strong throughout my undergraduate career, but knowing that medical school acceptance letters were waiting in my email inbox made every test and assignment feel both more important and less stressful. I was no longer studying to prove my worthiness for medical training. I was studying to prepare myself for the challenges that lay ahead. Rachel and I spent hours discussing our respective futures over coffee and late-night study sessions. She had been accepted to the post-baccalaureate program at Northwestern, a stepping stone toward her own medical school applications the following year. The parallel nature of our journeys felt both comforting and poignant, a reminder that success in medicine required not just individual achievement, but also the support of people who understood the sacrifices and compromises involved. Are you nervous about Rochester? She asked one evening as we reviewed biochemistry notes in preparation for our final exam. Terrified, I admitted. The Mayo Clinic has a reputation for excellence that's almost intimidating. I keep wondering if they made a mistake in selecting me, if I'll get there and discover that I'm not as prepared as the other fellows. Imposter syndrome is normal. Every medical student and resident I've talked to has felt the same way at some point. The fact that you're aware of how much you still need to learn is probably a good sign. What if I embarrass myself? What if I can't keep up with the research pace or ask stupid questions that reveal how little I actually know? Then you'll learn from the experience and become better prepared for medical school. The fellowship isn't a test that you can fail. It's an educational opportunity that will teach you things you can't learn anywhere else. Her confidence in my abilities was reassuring, but it didn't completely eliminate the anxiety that came with knowing I would soon be working alongside some of the most accomplished physicians and researchers in the world. The Mayo Clinic represented the pinnacle of medical excellence, and the opportunity to train there felt both like the culmination of everything I had worked toward and the beginning of challenges I couldn't yet imagine. Graduation day arrived with unseasonably warm weather and a campus full of families celebrating their children's achievement. I watched my classmates pose for photos with proud parents and grandparents, their graduation gowns billowing in the spring breeze, their faces bright with excitement about futures that seemed full of promise and possibility. My own celebration was smaller but no less meaningful. Rachel's parents had driven down from Minneapolis to attend both our ceremonies, and Dr. Foster had taken time out of her busy schedule to witness my transition from undergraduate student to medical school-bound researcher. We took photos by the campus landmarks where I had spent the last 4 years studying and growing and discovering who I wanted to become. "You should be very proud of what you've accomplished," Dr. Foster told me as we walked across campus after the ceremony. "The Mayo Clinic Fellowship is recognition of exceptional potential, but more importantly, it's an opportunity to work with mentors who will help you become the physician you're meant to be." I still can't quite believe it's real. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, like I somehow ended up in a story that was meant for someone more qualified or deserving. That feeling never completely goes away, even for experienced physicians. The practice of medicine is humbling in ways that force you to confront your limitations and constantly strive to become better, but that humility is what makes good doctors great. The recognition that there's always more to learn and better ways to serve patients. That evening, Rachel and I had our own private celebration at Giuseppe's, the same restaurant where we had celebrated my Mayo Clinic acceptance. The continuity felt intentional and satisfying, a way of marking the progression from one milestone to the next, while honoring the friendship that had sustained us both through the challenges of pre-medical training. "Promise me you'll stay in touch this summer," she said as we shared tiramisu and talked about our respective plans for the coming months. "Promise me you'll remember that Northwestern is lucky to have you, not the other way around." We made plans to visit each other during our respective programs, to maintain the connection that had been so crucial to our individual success. The prospect of spending the summer apart felt strange after 4 years of daily study sessions and shared anxiety, but it also felt like a natural evolution of our friendship, a recognition that we were both strong enough to pursue our dreams independently while still supporting each other from a distance. 2 weeks later, I was loading my car with everything I thought I would need for 10 weeks in Rochester: professional clothes for research presentations, casual clothes for evenings and weekends, books and notebooks for documenting my experience, and a carefully curated selection of comfort items that would help me feel at home in an unfamiliar city. The drive to Rochester took me through the heart of Minnesota's agricultural landscape, past fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon under a sky so blue it looked like something from a travel brochure. The journey felt symbolic, a physical transition from the familiar world of Cedar Falls to the unknown challenges and opportunities that awaited me at the Mayo Clinic. I had spoken to my research mentor, Dr. Michael Chen, twice by phone to discuss the project I would be working on and the expectations for my participation in the fellowship program. His work focused on the genetic factors that contributed to coronary artery disease, research that could eventually lead to more personalized treatments for patients with cardiovascular conditions. The complexity of the science was intimidating but exciting, a chance to contribute to knowledge that could directly impact patient care. Rochester revealed itself gradually as I drove through the outskirts of the city, past chain restaurants and shopping centers that could have belonged to any mid-sized American community. But as I approached the downtown area, the Mayo Clinic buildings began to dominate the landscape, their imposing architecture and obvious importance transforming the cityscape into something that felt both medical and monumental. The Gonda building rose 19 stories above the street level, its glass and steel facade reflecting the afternoon sunlight in ways that made it look like a beacon of healing and hope. Connected to it by skyways and underground tunnels were dozens of other buildings that housed clinics, laboratories, research facilities, and administrative offices, creating a medical campus that felt more like a small city than a hospital complex. I checked into my apartment in a building specifically designated for visiting students and researchers, a furnished studio that was functional if not luxurious. From my window on the 8th floor, I could see the Mayo Clinic campus spreading out below me, a constant reminder of the opportunity I had been given, and the expectations I would need to meet. That first evening in Rochester, I walked through the downtown area, and tried to absorb the reality of where I was and what I was about to begin. The streets were full of people who looked like patients and families, many of them carrying Mayo Clinic bags and wearing the slightly overwhelmed expressions of individuals who had traveled long distances to seek care for serious medical conditions. The weight of that responsibility was humbling. These people had come to the Mayo Clinic because they needed the best possible medical care, often as a last resort when other treatments had failed or when their conditions were too complex for community hospitals to handle effectively. The research I would be conducting over the next 10 weeks was connected to that mission, part of the ongoing effort to understand disease processes and develop better treatments for patients who depended on medical advances for their survival and quality of life. I ate dinner alone at a small restaurant near my apartment, reviewing the orientation materials I had received and trying to prepare myself mentally for the next morning's introduction to Dr. Chen's laboratory. The fellowship program would begin with a week of orientation activities, seminars on research methodology and medical ethics, meetings with other fellows and their mentors, and laboratory tours that would provide context for the specific projects we would be working on. The other fellows were an impressive group, students from medical schools across the country who had been selected based on their academic achievements and research potential. During our first group meeting, I listened to their introductions and felt that familiar mixture of excitement and intimidation that came with being surrounded by people who seemed more accomplished and confident than I felt. Sarah was starting medical school at Harvard in the fall, and had already published 2 papers on neuroscience research. David was entering his second year at Johns Hopkins, and had spent a gap year conducting malaria research in Kenya. Jessica was beginning her studies at UCSF and had worked as a research coordinator at the National Institutes of Health before medical school. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I spoke briefly about my cardiovascular research interests and my upcoming enrollment at the University of Minnesota. I didn't mention my family's initial skepticism about my medical school plans, or the personal significance of being accepted to this fellowship program. Those details felt too private and potentially irrelevant to share with people I was just meeting. Dr. Chen's laboratory was located on the 14th floor of the Guggenheim building, a space that hummed with the quiet intensity of serious scientific work. Graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting fellows moved between benches and equipment with the focused efficiency of people who understood both the importance and complexity of their research questions. "Natalie, welcome to our laboratory family," Dr. Chen said as he introduced me to the team members I would be working with most closely. "We're excited to have you contribute to our ongoing research on the genetic basis of coronary artery disease susceptibility." The project he outlined for me involved analyzing genetic data from patients who had experienced heart attacks at unusually young ages, looking for patterns that might explain why some people developed cardiovascular disease despite having apparently healthy lifestyles and no obvious risk factor. The work would require learning new analytical techniques, mastering software programs I had never used before, and developing a deeper understanding of both genetics and cardiovascular physiology than I had acquired during my undergraduate study. "This research has direct clinical applications," Dr. Chen explained as we toured the laboratory and he showed me the equipment I would be using. "If we can identify genetic markers that predict cardiovascular disease risk, we can potentially intervene earlier and more effectively to prevent heart attacks and strokes." The connection between laboratory research and patient care was immediately apparent and deeply motivating. This wasn't abstract science conducted for its own sake. It was work that could eventually save lives and improve outcomes for people facing serious medical conditions. My first week in the laboratory was overwhelming, but exhilarating. I spent hours each day learning new techniques, reviewing literature on cardiovascular genetics and beginning to analyze the data sets that would form the foundation of my research project. The learning curve was steep, but the support from Dr. Chen and his team made the challenges feel manageable rather than insurmountable. The other researchers in the laboratory were generous with their time and expertise, answering my questions with patience and providing guidance that helped me avoid common mistakes and navigate complex procedures more efficiently. The collaborative atmosphere was unlike anything I had experienced during my undergraduate studies, where academic achievement was often competitive and individual rather than team-based. "Research is fundamentally a collaborative endeavor," Chen told me during one of our weekly mentoring meetings. The questions we're trying to answer are too complex and important for any single person to solve alone. Learning to work effectively with others, to contribute your unique perspectives, while remaining open to different approaches, is as important as mastering any specific technical skill. The wisdom in his words became more apparent as I spent more time in the laboratory and began to appreciate the different strengths and perspectives that each team member brought to our shared research goal. Some people were naturally gifted at experimental design, others excelled at data analysis, and still others had intuitive insights about clinical applications that helped connect laboratory findings to patient care. My own contributions were initially modest, but gradually became more significant as I gained confidence and expertise. I discovered that I had a particular aptitude for pattern recognition in genetic data, an ability to spot relationships and anomalies that others sometimes missed. Dr. Chen began asking for my input on data interpretation and involving me in discussions about experimental design that extended beyond my specific project. "You have good scientific instincts," he told me after I identified a potential confounding variable that could have affected our result. "The ability to think critically about data and ask probing questions about methodology is essential for conducting meaningful research." The praise felt different from academic validation I had received in the past. This wasn't recognition for memorizing information or performing well on standardized tests. It was acknowledgement of my potential to contribute to the generation of new knowledge and the advancement of medical understanding. As the weeks passed, I found myself settling into a routine that felt both demanding and deeply satisfying. My days began early with reading scientific literature over coffee, continued with long hours in the laboratory conducting experiments and analyzing data, and often ended with seminars or journal clubs, where we discussed recent developments in cardiovascular research. The intellectual stimulation was constant and invigorating. Every day brought new questions to investigate, new techniques to master, and new insights about the complex biological processes that determined human health and disease. The work was challenging enough to stretch my capabilities without being so difficult as to feel impossible or overwhelming. But perhaps more importantly, I was beginning to develop a clearer sense of my own identity as a future physician and researcher. The Mayo Clinic environment encouraged thinking about medicine as more than just clinical practice. It was a field that encompassed scientific discovery, technological innovation, and the ongoing effort to understand human biology in ways that could improve patient outcomes. 6 weeks into the fellowship, I received an email that changed my understanding of how far news of my achievements had traveled and how dramatically my reputation had evolved in the eyes of people who had once questioned my abilities. The message was from Dr. Jennifer Morrison, the physician my brother had mentioned as being on the Mayo Clinic selection committee. "Dear Natalie, I hope your fellowship experience has been rewarding and educational. I wanted to reach out because I recently had an interesting conversation with your brother Marcus at a medical legal conference. He mentioned that you are his sister and expressed pride in your achievements and your bright future in medicine. I thought you should know that your work with Dr. Chen has been exceptional, and several faculty members have commented on your potential for a successful career in academic medicine. The Mayo Clinic would welcome your application for residency training when the time comes." I read the message twice before the full implications sank in. Marcus had been talking about me with pride rather than concern, describing my achievements as something to celebrate rather than worry about. More significantly, faculty members at the Mayo Clinic were already discussing my potential for future training opportunities, seeing me as someone worthy of continued investment and development. The transformation felt almost surreal. Less than a year ago, my family had been convinced that I was too emotionally unstable and intellectually limited to succeed in medicine. Now, physicians at one of the world's most prestigious medical institutions were viewing me as a promising future colleague and researcher. I called Rachel that evening to share the news, and her excitement was immediate and infectious. "I told you this would happen," she said, her voice bright with vindication and joy. "I told you that your family was wrong about your abilities and that you would prove them wrong in spectacular fashion. It still feels unreal sometimes. Like I'm living someone else's life, or experiencing some elaborate dream that I'm going to wake up from eventually." That's imposter syndrome, talking. You belong at the Mayo Clinic, Nat. You earned this opportunity through years of hard work and dedication, and you're succeeding because you have the intelligence and character to excel in this environment. As I prepared for the final weeks of my fellowship, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point, and the people who had supported or undermined my progress along the way. The contrast between my family's initial skepticism and the Mayo Clinic faculty's confidence in my abilities was stark and illuminating. A reminder that other people's opinions of your potential often say more about their own limitations than about your actual capabilities. The research project I had been working on was yielding promising results, and Dr. Chen had suggested that our findings might be significant enough to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. The prospect of having my name on a scientific paper before even beginning medical school felt like the culmination of everything I had worked toward, and the beginning of a career that was unfolding in ways I had never dared to imagine. But even more important than the professional recognition was the personal growth I had experienced during my time in Rochester. I had learned to trust my own judgment and abilities, to seek out challenges that stretched my capabilities, and to maintain confidence in my goals despite opposition from people whose opinions had once carried enormous weight in my life. The Mayo Clinic Fellowship had given me more than research experience and professional connections. It had given me proof that I was exactly where I belonged, pursuing exactly the path I was meant to follow, regardless of who believed in me or supported my choices. The final 2 weeks of my fellowship at the Mayo Clinic passed with the bittersweet intensity of an experience you know is transforming you, but will soon end. Dr. Chen had begun discussing the possibility of publishing our research findings, and I found myself staying late in the laboratory each evening, refining data analysis and contributing to the manuscript that would represent my first real contribution to medical literature. The other fellows and I had grown close during our time together, bonded by the shared experience of working alongside some of the world's most accomplished physicians and researchers. Our evening conversations over dinner often centered on our upcoming transitions to medical school, and the ways this fellowship had shaped our understanding of what it meant to be a physician in the 21st century. I feel like I understand medicine differently now, Sarah confided one evening, as we sat in a coffee shop near the Mayo campus. Before this summer, I thought being a doctor was about treating patients. Now I realize it's about constantly learning, constantly questioning, constantly trying to push the boundaries of what we know and what we can do. Her words resonated with my own evolving sense of professional identity. The fellowship had shown me that medicine was not just a career, but a calling that required intellectual curiosity, emotional resilience, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of caring for human beings. On my last day in the laboratory, Dr. Chen pulled me aside for a final mentoring conversation that felt more like a professional consultation between colleagues than a supervisor's evaluation of a student's performance. Natalie, your contributions to our research have been exceptional, he began, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had worked with hundreds of students and fellows over the course of his career. More importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of scientific thinking and clinical intuition that suggests you could have a very successful career in academic medicine. Thank you, Dr. Chen. This experience has been more valuable than I could have imagined. I want to discuss your future plans with you. I know you're starting medical school at the University of Minnesota in a few weeks, but I hope you'll consider applying for residency training here at Mayo when the time comes. We would welcome the opportunity to continue working with you. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from research opportunities during medical school to the various pathways for combining clinical practice with academic pursuits. Dr. Chen provided me with contacts at the University of Minnesota who could help me continue cardiovascular research during my medical training, and he offered to serve as a mentor and reference for future opportunity. As I packed up my belongings from the laboratory bench that had been my workspace for 10 weeks, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the experience and the people who had invested in my development. The Mayo Clinic had given me more than research skills and professional connections. It had given me confidence in my own potential and a clearer vision of the kind of physician I wanted to become. The drive back to Cedar Falls took me through the same agricultural landscape I had traveled 10 weeks earlier, but everything felt different now. I was returning not as an undergraduate student with hopes and dreams, but as someone who had proven herself capable of succeeding at the highest levels of medical training and research. My apartment felt smaller than I remembered, filled with belongings that seemed to belong to a younger version of myself. I spent the afternoon sorting through my possessions, deciding what to keep for medical school and what to donate or store, the process of winning down my material life feeling symbolic of the larger transitions I was navigating. Rachel returned from her post-baccalaureate program at Northwestern that same weekend, and we met for coffee at Brew Bean to catch up on our respective summers and prepare for our diverging paths ahead. She looked different, more confident, more focused, with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from spending time in an environment where your goals are understood and supported. "How was the Mayo Clinic?" she asked, though the answer was probably obvious from my expression. "Life-changing or career-defining." "Everything I hoped it would be and more than I expected it could be." I told her about the research project, about Dr. Chen's mentorship, about the conversations with faculty members who saw potential in me that I was only beginning to recognize in myself. She listened with the kind of attention that comes from genuine friendship, asking insightful questions, and celebrating my achievements without any trace of envy or competition. "And your family? Have you told them about how well things went?" "Not direct, but I think word is getting around through professional networks. My brother apparently mentioned me to one of the Mayo faculty members at a conference, describing me with what sounded like genuine pride rather than the concern and skepticism that used to characterize every family conversation about my career plans." "So they're coming around?" "Maybe. Or maybe they're just good at adapting their narrative when the evidence contradicts their previous assumptions. I'm not sure it matters anymore. Their approval isn't necessary for my success and their disapproval can't prevent it." The conversation drifted to our respective plans for the coming year. Rachel would be taking additional science courses to strengthen her medical school applications, while also working as a research coordinator at the university hospital. I would be starting medical school in 3 weeks, beginning the formal training that would transform me from a student with medical aspirations into a physician with the knowledge and skills to care for patients. 2 days later, I received a phone call that would test my newfound sense of professional confidence and personal independence. The caller ID showed my father's name, and I hesitated before answering, unsure whether I was ready for whatever conversation he might want to have. "Natalie, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just packing for medical school." "What can I do for you, Dad?" "I wanted to talk to you about something that's been weighing on my mind. Your mother told me about her visit to your apartment earlier this summer, and I've been thinking about the conversation you two had." I waited, giving him space to continue without committing myself to any particular response or emotional investment in whatever he might say. "I think we owe you a more complete apology than the one your mother offered. We made assumptions about your abilities and your chances of success that were clearly wrong, and we interfered in your academic life in ways that were inappropriate and potentially harmful." The words sounded more genuine than my mother's carefully rehearsed speech had been, though I remained skeptical about the motivations behind this apparent change of heart. What's prompted this realization? Several things. The Mayo Clinic Fellowship, obviously, but also conversations I've had with colleagues who know about your achievements and have commented on how impressive they are. Morrison mentioned you to Marcus, who mentioned it to me, and I realized that other people in our professional community know more about your accomplishments than your own parents do. That's by choice, Dad. I stopped sharing my achievements with you and Mom because your responses were consistently discouraging rather than supportive. I understand that now, and I want you to know that we're prepared to do whatever it takes to repair our relationship and support your medical career going forward. What does that look like practically? Financial support for medical school if you want it. No strings attached, no conditions or expectations beyond your own academic success. We want to invest in your future the way we should have been doing all along. The offer was tempting, both financially and emotionally. Medical school debt was a real concern, and family financial support could provide security and options that would be difficult to achieve through loans alone. But accepting their money would also mean reopening a relationship that I had worked hard to protect from their influence and control. I appreciate the offer, but I need to think about it. Financial support from family isn't just about money, it's about the emotional and relational dynamics that come with it. I understand your hesitation, but I want you to know that this offer comes with genuine pride in what you've accomplished and excitement about your future as a physician. We talked for another 20 minutes, covering everything from my research experience at Mayo to my upcoming move to Minneapolis for medical school. My father's tone was different from our previous conversations, more respectful, more interested in my perspectives, less focused on offering advice or expressing concerns about my choices. When we hung up, I felt emotionally drained but also cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. The conversation had felt more like a dialogue between adults than a lecture from parent to child, and his acknowledgement of their mistakes seemed more genuine than strategic, but I also recognized that one conversation couldn't undo months of conflict and years of conditional support. Trust would need to be rebuilt gradually, through consistent actions rather than promising words, and I would need to maintain healthy boundaries, regardless of how generous their financial offers might be. The next morning, I called Stephen Walsh, the law student who had helped me draft the cease and desist letter earlier in the year. I wanted his perspective on my family's apparent change of attitude and their offer of financial support for medical school. People's behavior often changes when the power dynamics shift, he said after I described my recent conversations with my parents. Your success at Mayo has given you credibility and leverage that you didn't have before. They can no longer dismiss your achievements or question your abilities without looking foolish. So you think their apologies are strategic rather than genuine? I think they're probably both. They may genuinely feel bad about how they treated you, but they're also responding to social and professional pressure that comes from being wrong about something so publicly and dramatically. What would you advise regarding their financial offer? That depends on your tolerance for complexity and your confidence in your ability to maintain boundaries. Their money could be helpful, but it could also give them a sense of ownership over your choices and decisions. You need to decide whether the financial benefits outweigh the potential emotional costs. His advice was characteristically practical and non-committal, leaving the decision in my hands while helping me think through the implications of different choices. I appreciated his refusal to tell me what to do while providing frameworks for making my own informed decision. Medical school orientation began on a Monday morning in late August, and I joined nearly 200 other first-year students in a lecture hall at the University of Minnesota Medical School. Looking around the room, I saw faces that reflected the same mixture of excitement and anxiety that I felt. People who had spent years preparing for this moment and were finally beginning the formal training that would transform them into physicians. Patricia Reeves, who had been my pre-med advisor and had supported me through the challenges of the previous year, was present for the orientation activities and made a point of congratulating me on my Mayo Fellowship and welcoming me to the medical school community. I'm proud of how you handled the difficulties with your family last year, she said during a brief conversation between orientation sessions. You showed remarkable maturity in protecting your academic relationships while pursuing your goals despite their interference. Their perspective seems to be changing now that I've proven them wrong. That's often how it works with families. Success has a way of clarifying relationships and forcing people to confront their own assumptions and bias. The orientation continued for 3 days, covering everything from academic expectations to professional ethics to the practical aspects of medical training. We toured the hospital facilities where we would be doing clinical rotations, met with faculty members who would be teaching our courses, and began to understand the scope and intensity of the education we were beginning. The academic workload was immediately apparent and somewhat overwhelming. Medical school would require mastering vast amounts of information in compressed time frames, developing clinical skills that could directly impact patient outcomes, and maintaining emotional resilience in the face of human suffering and medical uncertainty. But I felt more prepared for these challenges than I would have a year earlier, before the Mayo Fellowship had given me confidence in my ability to succeed in demanding academic environment. The research experience had taught me how to learn efficiently, how to ask productive questions, and how to maintain focus and motivation even when progress felt slow or difficult. My classmates came from diverse backgrounds and brought different strengths and perspectives to our shared educational journey. Some had taken gap years to conduct research or work in healthcare settings. Others had come straight from undergraduate studies, eager to begin medical training without delay. A few had previous careers in other fields and were pursuing medicine as a second profession. During our small group discussions, I found myself gravitating towards students who seemed genuinely curious about the scientific basis of medical practice, and who asked thoughtful questions about the connections between basic science and clinical care. These were people who understood that becoming a physician required more than memorizing facts. It required developing the ability to think critically about complex problems and to continue learning throughout their career. One of my classmates, David Kim, had spent 2 years working as a medical scribe at the Mayo Clinic before medical school, and we discovered that we had overlapping experiences and similar perspectives on the integration of research and clinical practice. The Mayo Fellowship Program has an excellent reputation, he told me during lunch on our second day of orientation. The students who complete it usually go on to very successful careers in academic medicine. I hope so. The experience definitely changed my understanding of what it means to be a physician in the 21st century. Have you thought about what specialty you might be interested in? Cardiology? Probably. My research experience focused on cardiovascular disease, and I found the intersection of basic science and clinical practice fascinating. We talked about our respective goals and the pathways for pursuing different specialties, the competitive nature of certain residency programs, and the importance of maintaining high academic performance, while also developing clinical skills and professional relationships. As the first weeks of medical school unfolded, I settled into a routine that was demanding but manageable. My days began early with review of lecture materials, continued with classes and laboratory sessions, and often ended with study groups and clinical skills practice. The pace was intense, but it felt sustainable in a way that my undergraduate coursework had not always been. The Mayo Fellowship experience had taught me how to approach complex materials systematically, how to identify the most important concepts and focus my energy accordingly, and how to seek help when I needed it without feeling like I was admitting inadequacy or failure. My grades during the first semester were consistently strong, placing me in the top quartile of my class, and earning recognition from faculty members who taught our core courses. More importantly, I felt intellectually engaged and professionally motivated in ways that confirmed I had chosen the right career path. In October, I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus, who was calling not to relay messages from our parents, but to share his own thoughts about my medical school experience and our family's evolving dynamics. "I owe you an apology, Nat," he said without preamble. "I was wrong about your chances of success in medicine, and I was wrong to support Mom and Dad's attempts to discourage you from pursuing medical school. What's changed your mind?" "Partly your obvious success, but also conversations I've had with medical professionals who know about your achievements and speak about them with genuine respect and admiration. Dr. Morrison mentioned you again at another conference, describing your research work as exceptional and your potential as very promising. I appreciate that, Mark. But I need you to understand that your support can't be conditional on external validation of my choices. If you're going to be my brother and my ally, you need to trust my judgment and support my goals even when other people aren't praising my achievements. You're right, and I understand that. I want to do better going forward." We talked for nearly an hour, covering everything from my medical school experience, to his own career challenges, to the ways our family relationships had been shaped by competition and conditional approval. It felt like the first genuine conversation we had shared in years, a dialogue between equals rather than a consultation between a successful older brother and a struggling younger sister. "Mom and Dad are serious about wanting to support your medical education financially," he said toward the end of our conversation. "They've set aside money specifically for that purpose, and they want you to know that it comes with no expectations or conditions beyond your own academic success. I'm still thinking about whether to accept their help. Financial support from family can be complicated, especially given our recent history. I understand your hesitation, but I also think they've learned something from this experience about the importance of supporting your choices, rather than trying to control them." After we hung up, I spent the evening walking around the university campus and thinking about the relationships that had shaped my journey to medical school and the ways those relationships were continuing to evolve. The conversation with Marcus had felt different from previous family interactions, more honest, more reciprocal, more focused on understanding than on persuasion. But I also recognized that rebuilding trust would require more than apologetic phone calls and promises of financial support. It would require consistent behavior over time, evidence that their newfound respect for my abilities and choices was genuine rather than simply a response to my obvious success. 2 weeks later, I made my decision about their financial offer. I called my father and explained that I would accept partial support for medical school expenses, enough to reduce my debt burden, without eliminating my financial independence entirely. The compromise felt appropriate, acknowledging their desire to contribute to my education while maintaining autonomy and protecting myself from the potential complications that could arise from complete financial dependence on family members who had recently been trying to derail my career plans. "That seems like a wise approach," my father said when I explained my reasoning. "We want to help, but we also want you to feel secure in your own independence and success." The conversation was brief but warm, focused on practical details rather than emotional reconciliation or extended discussions of past conflict. It felt like progress, a step toward a healthier family relationship that acknowledged our shared history while focusing on future possibilities rather than past grievances. As my first semester of medical school drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point, and the people who had supported or opposed my progress along the way. The contrast between my family's initial skepticism and their current pride was striking, but perhaps more important was my own growing confidence in my abilities and my increasingly clear sense of professional identity. The Mayo Clinic Fellowship had been a turning point, not just in terms of external recognition, but in terms of my own understanding of what I was capable of achieving. Working alongside world-class physicians and researchers had shown me that I belonged in that environment, that my contributions were valued, and that my potential was worthy of investment and development. Medical school was confirming and extending those lessons, challenging me academically while providing the foundational knowledge and skills I would need to become an effective physician. The workload was demanding, but it felt manageable in a way that reflected both my improved study skills and my genuine passion for the subject matter. My final grades for the first semester placed me second in my class, earning recognition on the dean's list and qualifying me for membership in the Medical Honor Society. More importantly, I felt intellectually engaged and professionally motivated, confident that I was pursuing the right career for the right reasons. The recognition felt different from undergraduate academic achievement. This wasn't just about getting good grades or meeting external expectations. It was about mastering knowledge and skills that would directly impact my ability to care for patients and contribute to medical progress. During winter break, I spent time in Cedar Falls visiting Rachel and catching up on her progress through her post-baccalaureate program. She had maintained her strong academic performance and was preparing to submit medical school applications for the following year's admission cycle. "You look different," she observed as we sat in our old corner booth at Brew Bean, surrounded by university students who reminded us of our own undergraduate years. "Different how?" "More confident, more settled. Like you know exactly who you are and where you're going." "I feel different. Medical school has been challenging, but it's also been confirming. Every day reinforces that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing." "And your family?" "Better. Still complicated, but better. They're supporting me financially and emotionally now, though I'm maintaining some boundaries to protect myself from falling back into old patterns." "You handled all of that really well. You protected yourself when you needed to, but you also stayed open to reconciliation when they showed genuine change." As I prepared to return to Minneapolis for my second semester of medical school, I felt a sense of completion about the conflicts that had dominated my life a year earlier. My family relationships were healthier but not perfect. My academic performance was strong but still required constant effort, and my professional future was promising but still uncertain in its specific detail. What had changed was my confidence in my own judgment and my ability to navigate challenges without depending on external validation or approval. The Mayo Clinic Fellowship had shown me that I could succeed at the highest levels of medical training and research. Medical school was confirming that I belonged in this profession and had the abilities to contribute meaningfully to patient care and medical progress. The journey from family skepticism to professional recognition had been difficult but ultimately transformative, teaching me lessons about resilience, self-advocacy, and the importance of pursuing your goals regardless of who believes in them or supports them. The experience had strengthened my character while clarifying my values and priorities in ways that would serve me well throughout my medical career. As I drove back to Minneapolis for the beginning of my second semester, I felt grateful for the challenges that had tested my determination and the successes that had validated my choices. The path ahead remained demanding, but I was traveling it with confidence, purpose, and the support of people who understood and respected my goal. The spring of my second year of medical school brought an unexpected phone call that would transform not only my understanding of my own potential but also the final dynamics of my relationship with my family. I was studying in the medical library, surrounded by pathophysiology textbooks and preparing for board examinations, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't immediately recognize. "Miss Harper, this is Dr. Elizabeth Martinez from the Mayo Clinic's Office of Academic Affairs. Do you have a few minutes to discuss an opportunity that might interest you?" The conversation that followed was surreal in its implications and timing. Dr. Martinez explained that the cardiovascular research I had conducted during my fellowship had yielded results significant enough to warrant publication in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, one of the most prestigious publications in cardiovascular medicine. More importantly, the research had caught the attention of the Mayo Clinic's Residency Selection Committee. "We rarely extend early invitations for residency positions," she continued, "but your research contributions and academic performance have been exceptional. We would like to offer you a guaranteed position in our internal medicine residency program, with the understanding that you would pursue a cardiology fellowship here after completing your internal medicine training." I sat in stunned silence for several moments, trying to process what she was telling me. The Mayo Clinic was offering me a residency position 2 full years before I would normally apply, essentially guaranteeing my training at one of the world's most prestigious medical institutions. "This is an extraordinary opportunity," I managed to say finally. "May I have some time to consider it?" "Of course, take all the time you need, but I want you to understand how unusual this offer is. We typically receive thousands of applications for our residency positions, and we're offering you one based on your demonstrated excellence as a student and research." After she hung up, I sat in the library for nearly an hour, staring at my textbooks without seeing them, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. The same institution where my family had once questioned my emotional stability was now offering me one of the most competitive residency positions in American medicine. The irony was almost overwhelming. 18 months earlier, my parents had been convinced that I was too intellectually limited and emotionally fragile to succeed in medical school. Now, the Mayo Clinic was essentially telling me that they wanted to invest 6 years in my training, because they saw exceptional potential in my abilities and character. I called Rachel first, interrupting her own medical school classes with news that made her scream so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Her excitement was immediate and unqualified, the response of someone who had always believed this moment would come even when I had doubted it myself. "This is vindication on a scale that even you couldn't have imagined," she said when she finally stopped celebrating. "The Mayo Clinic doesn't make offers like this lightly. They're essentially saying that you're among the most promising medical students in the country." I still can't quite believe it's real. Part of me keeps thinking that someone made a mistake or that there's some condition I don't understand yet. "No mistakes, Nat. This is recognition of everything you've accomplished and everything you're capable of achieving. Your family must be beside themselves with pride." But I hadn't told my family yet, and I wasn't sure when or how I would share this news. The relationship with my parents had improved significantly over the past year, but I remained cautious about involving them too deeply in my professional achievement. Their support had become more consistent, but I still remembered the pain of their earlier skepticism and interference. That evening, I drove to Cedar Falls to have dinner with Rachel and process this development with the person who had supported me through every challenge and celebration of my medical journey. We went to Giuseppe's, the restaurant that had become our traditional venue for marking important milestones, and I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since our undergraduate days. "So what happens now?" Rachel asked as we shared dessert and talked through the implications of the Mayo offer. "I accept it, obviously. This is the kind of opportunity that defines entire careers. But I also need to figure out how to handle the family dynamics that will inevitably arise when this news becomes public. What do you mean? My parents have been supportive for the past year, but that support has been largely reactive to my obvious success. I worry about what happens when they start taking credit for my achievements or trying to insert themselves into professional relationships that I've built independently. Rachel nodded, understanding the complex emotions that came with rebuilding family relationships after periods of conflict and disappointment. You get to control how much or how little you involve them in your success. The fact that they're proud of you now doesn't erase the fact that they actively worked against you when you needed their support most. I want to have a healthy relationship with them, but I also want to protect the professional identity I've built without their help or approval. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can love your family and appreciate their current support while also maintaining boundaries around your career and personal autonomy. The next morning, I called Martinez and formally accepted the Mayo Clinic's residency offer, a conversation that felt both momentous and anticlimactic. The decision was obvious given the prestige of the program and the exceptional nature of the opportunity, but accepting it also meant committing myself to a path that would keep me in Minnesota for the next 6 years of training. Word of my acceptance spread quickly through the University of Minnesota Medical School community, and I found myself fielding congratulations from classmates, faculty members and administrators who understood the significance of what had occurred. The dean of the medical school requested a meeting to discuss my achievement and its implications for the school's reputation and future partnerships with the Mayo Clinic. This reflects very well on our program, Dean Williams told me during our conversation. The Mayo Clinic's decision to extend an early residency offer to one of our students is a testament to the quality of education we provide and the caliber of students we attract. The institutional pride was gratifying, but I was more interested in discussing the practical implications of my remaining 2 years of medical school and how to best prepare for the challenges of residency training at such a prestigious institution. 3 days after accepting the Mayo offer, I received a phone call from my father that suggested the news had reached my family through the same professional networks that had initially informed them of my fellowship acceptance. Natalie, your mother and I just heard the most wonderful news from Dr. Morrison. Is it true that the Mayo Clinic has offered you a residency position? Yes, it's true. They extended an early offer based on my research work and academic performance. This is extraordinary, sweetheart. We are so incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with my father asking detailed questions about the residency program, the timeline for my training, and the career opportunities that would likely follow from such prestigious preparation. His tone was entirely different from our conversations 2 years earlier, respectful, interested, and genuinely celebratory rather than concerned or skeptical. We'd love to take you to dinner to celebrate, he said toward the end of our conversation. Somewhere special where we can properly acknowledge this incredible achievement. I agreed to the dinner, partly out of genuine appreciation for their current support and partly out of curiosity about how they would handle this level of success after their earlier predictions of failure and disappointment. The celebration dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday at the Grandview, the same restaurant where they had staged their intervention 18 months earlier to convince me that medical school was an unrealistic goal. The symmetry felt intentional, though I wasn't sure whether it represented their desire to make amends for that previous gathering or simply their limited imagination regarding appropriate venues for important family conversation. Rachel offered to accompany me for moral support, but I decided to handle this family interaction independently, confident in my ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while appreciating their genuine excitement about my achievement. The restaurant looked exactly the same as it had during that difficult evening in my senior year of college, but everything else felt transformed by the intervening months of growth and success. I arrived to find my entire family already gathered at our usual table, my parents, Marcus and Vanessa, and even my Aunt Carol and Uncle Tom, who had driven from Des Moines to participate in what they clearly considered a momentous family celebration. "There she is," my mother said as I approached the table, her voice carrying the kind of pride that I had once desperately wanted to hear and now appreciated with some emotional distance. Our future Mayo Clinic physician. The evening proceeded with the kind of celebratory energy that I had imagined family gatherings might have if they had always supported my goals and believed in my ability. Stories were shared about my childhood interests in science and medicine, toasts were offered to my future success, and plans were discussed for visiting me during my residency training in Rochester. Marcus stood to offer a formal toast midway through dinner, his words carefully chosen and obviously rehearsed. To Natalie, who had the vision to pursue her dreams and the determination to achieve them despite every obstacle and challenge. We are proud to be your family and we can't wait to see what you accomplish next. The sentiment was generous and apparently sincere, though I couldn't help remembering that Marcus had been among those obstacles and challenges he was now celebrating me for overcoming. The evolution of his perspective was striking but also somewhat revisionist, editing out the periods when he had supported our parents' skepticism about my chances of success. My father's remarks were more personal and more explicitly apologetic, acknowledging their earlier mistakes and expressing admiration for my persistence in pursuing medical training despite their discouragement. Your mother and I have learned something important from watching your journey, he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. We learned that our job as parents isn't to protect you from pursuing difficult goals, it's to support you in achieving them. We're sorry it took us so long to understand that lesson. The apology felt more complete and authentic than previous attempts at reconciliation, perhaps because it was being offered from a position of obvious vindication rather than defensive damage control. They could afford to be generous in acknowledging their mistakes now that my success had proven them so dramatically wrong. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying the celebration while also maintaining emotional distance from the family dynamics that had once felt so central to my sense of self-worth. Their pride and support were pleasant to experience, but they no longer felt necessary for my confidence or motivation. What's your timeline for the residency? Vanessa asked as we shared dessert and discussed my future plan. I'll finish medical school here at Minnesota, then start internal medicine residency at Mayo in 2 years. After that, cardiology fellowship for another 3 years, 6 more years of training, my mother observed. That's a significant commitment. It's the standard pathway for becoming a cardiologist at that level, he explained. The Mayo Clinic program is among the most competitive in the country, so the training is correspondingly intensive. Will you have time for a personal life during all that training? Aunt Carol asked, her question carrying the familiar family preoccupation with marriage and family planning that had always been applied to my choices, but never to Marcus's equally demanding career path. I'll have whatever personal life I choose to prioritize, he replied, my tone polite but firm. Medical training is demanding, but people manage to maintain relationships and personal interests throughout their residencies and fellowships. The conversation moved on to safer topics, but the exchange reminded me that even this improved version of family support came with subtle expectations and assumptions about how I should balance professional and personal priorities. Toward the end of the evening, my mother pulled me aside for a private conversation that felt like both an attempt at deeper reconciliation and a final effort to reestablish some maternal influence over my choices and decisions. Natalie, I want you to know how sorry I am for the way we handled your medical school plans initially, she said, her voice carrying genuine regret. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment, but we were really projecting our own fears and limitations onto your situation. I appreciate that acknowledgement, Mom. It means a lot to hear you say it directly. I also want you to know that we're here to support you in whatever ways you need during your residency training. Financial assistance, emotional support, practical help with logistics, whatever would be most useful. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind as I navigate the next few years. And I hope you'll share your experiences with us more openly than you have been. We want to be part of your journey going forward, to celebrate your successes and support you through any challenges that arise. The request was reasonable and seemed to come from genuine desire for closer family relationships, rather than attempts to control or manage my choices. But I also recognized that rebuilding trust would require consistent behavior over time, rather than good intentions expressed during celebratory dinners. I'm open to that, Mom. But I need you to understand that my willingness to share my experiences will depend on how you respond to both my successes and my struggles. Support means accepting my judgment about my own life rather than trying to redirect it toward your preferences. She nodded solemnly, apparently understanding that this conversation represented a negotiation about the terms of our future relationship, rather than simply a return to previous family dynamic. The drive back to Minneapolis that night gave me time to process the evening and reflect on how dramatically my family relationships had evolved over the past 2 years. The contrast between this celebration and their previous interventions was striking, but perhaps more important was my own emotional response to their changed behavior. Their pride and support felt pleasant, but not essential, appreciated but not desperately needed. I had learned to validate my own achievements and trust my own judgment in ways that made external approval less crucial to my sense of self-worth and professional confidence. The final 18 months of medical school passed with increasing momentum and clarity about my future direction. My academic performance remained consistently strong, placing me in the top 5% of my class and earning additional recognition from faculty members who taught our advanced clinical courses. More importantly, my clinical rotations during the 3rd and 4th years of medical school confirmed my passion for internal medicine and cardiology, while providing hands-on experience with patient care that felt both challenging and deeply satisfying. During my cardiology rotation at the University of Minnesota Hospital, I worked with Dr. Sarah Peterson, an attending physician who had completed her own training at the Mayo Clinic, and who provided insights into what I could expect during my residency year. The Mayo program will push you harder than anything you've experienced so far, she told me during one of our mentoring conversations, but it will also give you training and opportunities that are available nowhere else in the world. You'll work with patients whose cases are too complex for community hospitals, and you'll learn from physicians who are advancing the field through their research and clinical innovations. Any advice for preparing for that level of intensity? Maintain your curiosity and humility. The most successful residents are those who remain eager to learn and willing to acknowledge what they don't know. The knowledge base is vast, but the learning opportunities are extraordinary if you approach them with the right attitude. My research publication from the Mayo Fellowship was officially released during my 4th year of medical school, with my name listed as second author on a paper that was cited almost immediately by other researchers working on similar questions about genetic factors in cardiovascular disease. Seeing my name in print in a major medical journal felt like tangible proof that I was contributing to medical knowledge in ways that could eventually benefit patient care. Dr. Chin contacted me when the paper was published, expressing pride in our collaborative work and enthusiasm about future research opportunities during my residency training. This publication will open doors for you throughout your career, he said during our phone conversation. Having peer-reviewed research published as a medical student is unusual and impressive, especially in a journal of this caliber. The recognition felt different from academic achievements I had earned in the past. This wasn't just about meeting requirements or demonstrating competence. It was about contributing new knowledge to the medical field and establishing myself as someone capable of advancing scientific understanding through original research. My medical school graduation was scheduled for a Saturday morning in May, and my family had planned their attendance with the kind of elaborate coordination typically reserved for weddings or other major life events. They had reserved hotel rooms, made dinner reservations, and invited extended family members to witness what they now described as the culmination of years of hard work and dedication. The ceremony itself was both meaningful and anticlimactic, a formal recognition of the completion of 4 years of intensive education, but also just one step in a much longer journey toward becoming a practicing physician. As I walked across the stage to receive my medical degree, I felt grateful for the opportunity and confident about the path ahead, while also recognizing that the real learning was just beginning. The post-graduation celebrations with my family were warm and generous, characterized by the kind of pride and support that I had once desperately wanted and now appreciated with some emotional perspective. They had clearly committed themselves to being positive and encouraging family members, and their efforts felt genuine even if they were also somewhat performative. Dr. Natalie Harper, my father said during his toast at the graduation dinner. We are so proud of who you've become and excited about the physician you're going to be. The title felt strange and wonderful, a formal recognition of the transformation that had occurred over the past 4 years of medical school. I was no longer a student with medical aspirations. I was a doctor preparing for residency training at one of the world's most prestigious medical institutions. Rachel had graduated from her post-baccalaureate program that same spring, and had been accepted to medical school at Northwestern, beginning her own journey toward a career in medicine. Our friendship had evolved but remained strong, grounded in shared experiences and mutual support that had sustained us both through the challenges of pursuing medical careers. You did it, she said, as we sat in our old corner booth at Giuseppe's for what might be the last time before we both moved on to the next phases of our training. You proved everyone wrong and achieved everything you set out to accomplish. We both did. Neither of us would be here without the friendship and support we've given each other. What's next? Besides obviously conquering cardiology and probably winning a Nobel Prize eventually. Residency at Mayo, then fellowship, then hopefully a career that combines clinical practice with research and teaching. I want to contribute to advancing cardiovascular medicine while also caring for patients whose lives depend on the knowledge and skills I'm developing. And your family? How are things looking on that front? Better, not perfect, but better. They've learned to support my choices rather than trying to control them, and I've learned to appreciate their support without depending on it for my sense of self-worth. The transition to residency training at the Mayo Clinic felt both exciting and intimidating, a step into a professional environment where the expectations and responsibilities would be unlike anything I had experienced during medical school. But I felt prepared for those challenges in ways that reflected not just my academic training but also the personal growth that had occurred throughout my journey from skeptical family member to confident physician in training. My first day of residency began with orientation activities that introduced me to the other internal medicine residents, a group of exceptional physicians in training who had been selected from thousands of applicants, based on their academic achievements, research experience, and potential for excellence in patient care. Dr. Amanda Foster, the cardiologist who had been my mentor during undergraduate research, attended the orientation as a faculty representative and made a point of congratulating me on reaching this milestone in my medical career. I knew when we first met that you had the potential for something special, she said during a brief conversation between orientation sessions. Watching you develop from an undergraduate student into a physician has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my own career. Thank you for believing in me before I learned to believe in myself. Your mentorship changed the trajectory of my entire life. You changed your own trajectory through hard work and determination. I just provided some guidance along the way. The conversation reminded me of how much my professional identity had been shaped by mentors who had recognized potential in me and provided opportunities for growth and development. From Dr. Foster's early guidance to Chan's research mentorship to the Mayo Clinic's unprecedented residency offer, my career had been advanced by people who had invested in my success when investment required vision rather than obvious payoff. As I settled into the demanding routine of residency training, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point, and the people who had supported or opposed my progress along the way. The contrast between my family's initial skepticism and the Mayo Clinic's confidence in my abilities was striking, but perhaps more important was my own evolution from someone who needed external validation to someone who could trust her own judgment and ability. The residency was every bit as challenging as Dr. Peterson had predicted, with long hours, complex cases, and constant pressure to master new knowledge and skills while providing excellent patient care. But it was also deeply fulfilling in ways that confirmed I had chosen the right career path and the right training environment. 6 months into my residency, I received a phone call from a journalist writing an article about exceptional medical trainees for a national healthcare publication. She had learned about my early research publications and unusual residency pathway, and wanted to include my story as an example of emerging talent in academic medicine. Your research work as a medical student was quite remarkable, she said during our interview. And the Mayo Clinic's decision to extend an early residency offer suggests they see exceptional potential in your abilities. What do you think distinguishes your approach to medicine and medical training? I think persistence and curiosity are probably the most important qualities for success in medicine, I replied, thinking about the lessons I had learned throughout my journey. The willingness to keep pursuing your goals despite obstacles and setbacks, and the commitment to continuous learning even when the material is challenging or unfamiliar. Any advice for other students who might be facing skepticism about their medical school ambition? Trust your own judgment about your abilities and potential. Other people's opinions about what you can or can't achieve often reflect their own limitations rather than accurate assessments of your capability. The interview was published 2 months later in a feature article about rising stars in academic medicine, with my photograph and a detailed account of my research work and residency training. The recognition felt gratifying, but more importantly, it felt like evidence that I was contributing meaningfully to the medical profession and establishing myself as someone worth following and learning from. My parents called immediately after the article was published, their voices carrying the kind of excitement that suggested they had already shared the news with everyone in their social and professional circle. "We are so proud of you, sweetheart," my mother said, her tone combining genuine emotion with obvious satisfaction about being able to claim association with my achievements. "This article captures everything we love about your dedication and accomplishments. Thank you, Mom. It's nice to see the research work getting recognition in the broader medical community. Your father and I have been thinking about framing the article and displaying it in our home. Would that be all right with you?" The request was touching and slightly amusing, a desire to publicly associate themselves with success they had once predicted would never occur. I gave my permission readily, recognizing that their pride was genuine even if it was also somewhat self-serving. As my residency training progressed and my clinical skills developed, I began to understand what Dr. Foster had meant about medicine being a humbling profession that required constant learning and growth. Every patient presented new challenges and learning opportunities. Every case required integrating vast amounts of medical knowledge with careful clinical reasoning, and every outcome provided feedback about the effectiveness of my diagnostic and treatment decisions. But I also felt confident in my abilities and prepared for the challenges in ways that reflected all the experiences that had brought me to this point. The Mayo Clinic Fellowship had taught me how to approach complex problems systematically. Medical school had provided the foundational knowledge needed for clinical practice. The research publication had established my credibility as someone capable of contributing to medical knowledge, and the family conflicts had taught me to trust my own judgment while maintaining resilience in the face of opposition or skepticism. 3 years into my internal medicine residency, as I prepared to begin my cardiology fellowship training, I found myself reflecting on the conversation that had started this entire journey. My mother's public assertion that I was too stupid for medicine felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime, a moment that had once felt devastating but now seemed almost quaint in its complete disconnection from reality. The Mayo Clinic had not only validated my abilities, but had invested years in developing my potential as a physician and researcher. My research was being cited by other scientists working on cardiovascular disease. My clinical skills were being recognized by attending physicians who supervised some of the best residents in the country, and my future career prospects included opportunities that exceeded even my most optimistic undergraduate fantasy. But perhaps more importantly, I had learned to validate my own achievements and trust my own assessment of my abilities and potential. The journey from family skepticism to professional recognition had taught me lessons about resilience, self-advocacy, and the importance of pursuing your goals regardless of who believes in them or supports them. On the morning I received official confirmation of my acceptance into the Mayo Clinic's cardiology fellowship program, completing a pathway that would provide 6 years of training at one of the world's most prestigious medical institutions, I sat in my apartment and called Rachel to share the news. "From too stupid for medicine to cardiology fellow at the Mayo Clinic," she said, her voice carrying the same excitement and vindication that had characterized every milestone we had celebrated together. "That's not just proving them wrong, that's rewriting the entire narrative about what you're capable of achieving. It feels surreal sometimes, like I'm living someone else's life or experiencing some elaborate dream. No dreams now, just the natural consequences of talent, hard work, and the courage to pursue your goals despite every obstacle and discouragement. That afternoon, I called my parents to share the fellowship news, a conversation that had become routine, given their transformation into enthusiastic supporters of my medical career. "This is wonderful, sweetheart," my father said, his voice carrying genuine pride and excitement. "A cardiology fellowship at the Mayo Clinic represents the pinnacle of medical training. We couldn't be more proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you, Dad. It's been an incredible journey. We've learned so much from watching you pursue your goals with such determination and success. You've taught us important lessons about supporting our children's dreams rather than limiting them based on our own fears and assumptions." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from my fellowship training plans to their desire to celebrate this achievement with another family gathering. Their support felt genuine and appreciated, though it no longer felt necessary for my confidence or sense of professional identity. As I hung up the phone and returned to studying for my residency examinations, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point and the people who had supported my progress along the way. The path from family skepticism to professional recognition had been difficult but ultimately transformative, teaching me lessons about perseverance and self-belief that would serve me throughout my career as a physician and researcher. The Mayo Clinic Fellowship would provide 3 more years of intensive training in cardiovascular medicine, preparing me for a career that would combine clinical practice with research and teaching at the highest levels of academic medicine. But more importantly, it represented the fulfillment of dreams that had once seemed impossible to people who claimed to know me best, and the validation of beliefs about my own potential that I had learned to maintain, despite every discouragement and obstacle. Sometimes the deepest validation comes not from proving other people wrong, but from proving yourself right about your own capabilities and work. The journey from too stupid for medicine to Mayo Clinic cardiology fellow had taught me that the most important voice in determining your potential is your own, and that persistence in pursuing your goals can overcome almost any form of skepticism or opposition. As I prepared for the next phase of my medical training, I felt confident that I was exactly where I belonged, pursuing exactly the path I was meant to follow, surrounded by people who recognized and supported my potential, rather than limiting it based on their own fears and assumptions. The transformation felt complete, but the journey was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.